They said the cloud storage didn't matter. It had the deed to a house none of us knew she owned. I want to start with that sentence because for nearly 2 years following my mother's death, I believed my family had accounted for essentially everything meaningful in her modest estate, a belief that persisted right up until I finally decided to investigate a single password she had left me on a small note tucked inside her favorite cookbook, a password that unlocked a cloud storage account revealing a property deed to a house none of us had any idea she actually owned. I want to tell you exactly how I discovered this, and exactly what it revealed about my mother's careful, private planning, because I think if you've ever assumed that a loved one's digital life held nothing of genuine significance simply because it felt less tangible than their physical belongings, you already understand the particular, quiet astonishment of learning exactly how wrong that assumption actually was. Hello, and welcome. This is a quiet place for stories about the careful, private planning our loved ones sometimes leave behind, and the specific, undeniable truths those plans eventually reveal, often through the most unexpected, ordinary circumstances. If any part of this story feels familiar to you, I hope you'll stay until the end. My name is Sabine. I am 36 years old, and 2 years ago, following my mother's death, my siblings and I focused our entire estate settlement process on her physical belongings, her house, her furniture, her modest savings, largely dismissing her digital accounts and cloud storage as containing little more than old family photographs, until a single password she had specifically left me recently revealed a formal property deed to a house worth considerably more than the rest of her estate combined. I want to tell you about my mother first, and about her specific relationship with technology, because understanding this context matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. My mother, Odette, was 71 years old when she passed away, a woman who had adapted, throughout her later years, to using various digital tools and online accounts with considerably more comfort and consistency than many people her own age typically managed. Largely out of necessity, given that she worked part-time, well into her late 60s, doing remote bookkeeping for several small local businesses. I remember watching my mother learn to navigate various software programs and online banking systems throughout my own adult years, always with a particular, patient determination, understanding that maintaining this specific technical competence allowed her to continue working the kind of flexible, remote bookkeeping positions she genuinely enjoyed, well past the age when many of her own peers had already fully retired. I remember her often joking, during family gatherings, that she'd become more comfortable with spreadsheets than most people half her age, a specific pride she carried in her own continued technical capability that, I now understand, likely made her considerably more comfortable managing the kind of careful, private digital record-keeping that would eventually reveal her most significant, unexpected secret. I remember, too, a specific afternoon when she was teaching me how to properly organize my own digital files, insisting, with genuine conviction, that everyone should keep at least one clearly labeled folder somewhere accessible containing anything truly important, a piece of practical advice I absorbed at the time as simply reasonable, general guidance, never once suspecting that she was likely describing, quite literally, the exact system she herself had already built for the specific purpose of eventually reaching me. I want to tell you about my mother's final illness, because understanding this period matters enormously for everything that eventually happened regarding her estate. My mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer approximately 3 years before her death, a diagnosis that, given its typically advanced stage at detection, gave her doctors relatively limited options for extending her life significantly beyond a year or two following diagnosis, though she ultimately lived considerably longer than her original prognosis suggested, a testament I've always believed to her own quiet, determined resilience. I remember the specific afternoon she told me about this diagnosis, sitting together at her own kitchen table, her voice carrying a steady, measured calm that I recognized, even in that devastating moment, as her particular way of managing difficult news, absorbing it fully before allowing herself to express whatever fear or grief she genuinely carried privately. I remember her telling me, that same afternoon, that she intended to keep living her life as fully and independently as her health allowed for as long as possible, a determination she genuinely maintained throughout the following 3 years, continuing her part-time bookkeeping work well into her final year, understanding, I think now, that this continued independence likely extended to other private matters she never fully disclosed to any of us either. I remember, in retrospect, several small moments throughout those final 3 years that likely reflected her ongoing private management of this specific property, brief phone calls she'd occasionally step away to take, mentioning only vaguely that they were work-related, a specific folder of paperwork she kept in a locked drawer in her own home office that I never once thought to ask about, understanding it simply as ordinary financial record-keeping rather than anything requiring particular curiosity on my part. I want to tell you about my own relationship with my mother during this final period, because understanding this genuine, sustained closeness matters for everything that eventually happened. I visited my mother frequently throughout her final years, helping manage her medical appointments and various practical needs as her condition gradually progressed, a closeness that, I now understand, gave her considerable opportunity to prepare specific, careful plans she never fully explained to me directly during her own lifetime. I want to tell you about my siblings, Marcus and Elise, because understanding their own relationship to our mother's eventual estate matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded. Marcus, my older brother by 5 years, and Elise, my younger sister by 3 years, both maintained warm, genuine relationships with our mother throughout her illness, though both lived considerably farther away than I did, meaning their own involvement in her day-to-day care remained somewhat less intensive than my own, a difference in circumstance rather than any difference in genuine love or concern. I remember Marcus and Elise both visiting frequently during our mother's final year, taking turns staying with her for extended weekends whenever their own work schedules allowed, genuinely committed to sharing whatever caregiving responsibilities distance made practical for them to manage. I remember our mother often remarking, with genuine warmth, how grateful she felt having all 3 of her children so involved in her care, a gratitude I understood, at the time, as reflecting simply her overall satisfaction with our family's support, but that I now recognize likely also reflected her own quiet, private awareness that she was simultaneously managing something considerably more significant entirely on her own, without any of us realizing it. I want to tell you about our mother's actual passing, because understanding the immediate aftermath matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded regarding her estate. My mother passed away 2 years ago, at home, with hospice care support, a passing that, while genuinely difficult, at least allowed our family the mercy of time to say what needed to be said, given the more gradual nature of her illness's final progression. I remember those final days clearly. All 3 of us gathered together at her bedside, taking turns sitting with her through the quiet, difficult hours, understanding, collectively, that we were approaching the end of something none of us felt genuinely prepared for, despite the years of warning her diagnosis had provided. I remember her final, peaceful breath, the specific stillness that settled over that room afterward, and I remember, in the days immediately following, focusing almost entirely on the practical, exhausting logistics of funeral arrangements and immediate family support, with absolutely no reason, at that specific time, to imagine that her modest, visible estate represented anything less than the complete, genuine picture of everything she'd left behind. I want to walk you through the estate settlement process that followed, because understanding exactly how our mother's belongings came to be managed matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Our mother's estate was relatively modest by conventional standards: her small house, some modest savings, and various personal belongings, and her will divided everything equally among the three of us, a straightforward arrangement that our family navigated without any particular disagreement or complication. I remember our family's own attorney walking us through the estate's specific terms during a single, relatively brief meeting, the modest scope of what our mother had left behind, making the entire process feel considerably more straightforward than I imagine many families experience during more complicated estate disputes. I remember feeling, throughout this process, a specific gratitude that our family's genuine closeness meant this difficult period involved shared grief rather than any significant conflict regarding how our mother's belongings should be divided. I want to tell you about the specific approach our family took regarding our mother's digital accounts and cloud storage, because understanding this genuine oversight matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. During our initial estate settlement discussions, we briefly addressed the question of our mother's various online accounts, her email, her cloud photo storage, her social media presence, and our family collectively agreed that these accounts likely contained little beyond sentimental family photographs and routine correspondence, deciding, without much further discussion, that thoroughly investigating them wasn't a particular priority compared to the more immediate, practical work of settling her physical estate. I remember that specific conversation taking place almost as an afterthought during one of our broader estate meetings, Marcus mentioning briefly that we should probably eventually download her photo albums before her accounts were potentially deactivated, and all three of us agreeing, casually, that this represented the extent of what genuinely required our attention regarding her digital presence. I remember none of us spending more than a few minutes discussing this specific topic, understanding it, at the time, as simply a minor, sentimental task rather than anything requiring the kind of careful, thorough investigation we brought to her more obviously significant physical assets. I want to describe the specific reasoning behind this decision because understanding our family's genuine, if ultimately mistaken assumptions, matters for everything that eventually happened. None of us, myself included, considered our mother's digital life as containing anything of significant financial or legal importance, understanding her, as we always had, as someone whose actual, meaningful assets existed entirely within the physical, tangible world of her house and her modest savings account. I want to tell you about the specific note my mother left me, because understanding this small, private gesture matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded. Approximately 6 months before her death, my mother handed me a small, sealed envelope, telling me only that it contained a password I might eventually need, without offering any further explanation regarding what this password actually unlocked or why she was entrusting it to me specifically, rather than to either of my siblings. I remember that specific afternoon clearly, sitting with her in her own living room, both of us watching an old movie she particularly loved, when she paused the film abruptly and retrieved this small envelope from a drawer in her side table. I remember her handing it to me with a specific, deliberate seriousness that felt somewhat at odds with the otherwise casual, comfortable afternoon we'd been sharing. And I remember her simply saying, "Keep this somewhere safe, Sabine. You'll know when you need it," before returning to our movie as though nothing particularly significant had just occurred. I remember, too, the specific quality of that afternoon light through her living room window, the particular movie we'd been watching, one she'd shown me countless times throughout my own childhood. And I remember, looking back now, wondering whether she had specifically chosen that particular comfortable, familiar setting deliberately, understanding, perhaps, that delivering this kind of significant responsibility within an ordinary, comforting moment might make it feel less alarming than a more formal, serious conversation would have. I remember her hands, when she passed me the envelope, steadier than they'd been in recent weeks, a small, specific detail I hadn't thought much of at the time, but that I've returned to often since, wondering whether this particular task had carried enough importance to her that she'd summoned whatever physical steadiness she still had left to deliver it properly. I want to describe my reaction to receiving this note at the time, because understanding my genuine, limited attention to it matters for everything that eventually happened. I want to be honest that I did not press her for further explanation at the time, understanding, given her declining health, that she likely had her own reasons for handling this particular matter with the specific vagueness she chose, and trusting that whatever significance this password eventually held would become clear when the time genuinely came. I remember tucking that envelope into my own purse that same evening, genuinely intending to find some appropriately secure place for it once I returned home. And I remember, in the specific whirlwind of managing her increasingly demanding care needs over the following months, simply forgetting about it entirely until I happened to be organizing some of my own belongings weeks later and rediscovered it tucked inside her cookbook, where I'd apparently placed it without any particular conscious memory of doing so. I want to tell you about where I actually kept this envelope following my mother's death, because understanding this genuine, unremarkable storage matters for everything that eventually happened. I placed the small envelope inside my mother's favourite cookbook, a specific, sentimental choice I made somewhat instinctively, understanding that cookbook as one of the few physical items I had specifically requested to keep for myself during our family's broader estate division. And I want to be honest that I genuinely forgot about this envelope's existence for nearly the following 2 years. I want to describe the specific circumstances that eventually led me to rediscover this envelope, because this discovery emerged, almost entirely by accident, during a period when I had no particular reason to be investigating my mother's estate any further. Approximately 3 months ago, I decided to finally organize my own kitchen more thoroughly, a routine domestic task entirely unconnected to any renewed interest in my mother's estate, and I pulled out her old cookbook, intending simply to transfer several favorite recipes into a more modern, digital format. I remember that specific Saturday afternoon clearly. My own kitchen counters covered in various cookbooks and loose recipe cards I'd been meaning to organize for months. My mother's own well-worn cookbook sitting near the top of this considerable pile, its cover softened and slightly stained from decades of actual, genuine use in her own kitchen. I remember flipping through its pages somewhat idly, pausing occasionally to reread her own handwritten notes in the margins beside specific recipes, small adjustments and personal touches she'd added over the years, feeling the particular, bittersweet nostalgia that comes from handling an object so genuinely saturated with a loved one's actual presence. I want to describe the specific moment I rediscovered this envelope, because it represents the actual beginning of everything I eventually discovered. The small envelope fell out from between the cookbook's pages as I flipped through it, and I remember picking it up, genuinely surprised, having entirely forgotten its existence during the intervening 2 years since my mother had first handed it to me. I remember sitting down slowly at my own kitchen table, the envelope in my hands, memory gradually returning of that specific afternoon, watching an old movie together, my mother's careful seriousness as she'd handed it to me, a memory I hadn't consciously revisited in the 2 years since. I remember feeling a specific, quiet flutter of anticipation opening it, uncertain what I might actually find inside, but understanding, somehow, that whatever it contained likely carried more significance than I'd initially assumed during that original, brief exchange. I want to tell you about opening this envelope, because reading its contents began the process that would eventually reveal something considerably significant about my mother's careful, private planning. Inside was a simple, handwritten password on a small slip of paper, along with a brief note indicating that this password would grant access to a specific cloud storage account. an account name I didn't immediately recognize as one of my mother's more commonly used digital services. I want to describe my reaction to finding this specific information, because understanding my genuine, growing curiosity matters for everything that eventually happened. I decided, somewhat idly at first, to attempt logging into this specific account using the password my mother had provided, genuinely uncertain what I might find, but curious enough, given the specific care she had taken to preserve and eventually deliver this particular information, that I felt compelled to investigate further. I remember typing that password into my own laptop with a specific, growing nervousness, the account name itself, some generic cloud storage service I didn't immediately recognize as one of my mother's usual digital tools, adding to my sense that whatever I was about to find likely represented something considerably more deliberate and significant than a simple backup of family photographs. I remember the specific loading screen taking what felt like an unusually long few seconds, my own heart beating slightly faster as I waited, some instinctive part of me already sensing that this particular password unlocked something my mother had specifically, carefully intended for me to eventually discover. I want to tell you about what I discovered upon successfully logging into this account, because this discovery represents the actual turning point of this entire story. The account contained a single, carefully organized folder, labeled simply with my own name, containing several formal documents I had never previously seen, including a property deed indicating that my mother had privately purchased a small residential property nearly 12 years before her death, a property located in a different town, roughly 2 hours from where I lived, one none of us in our family had ever known she owned. I remember scrolling through this folder slowly, opening each document one at a time, my own understanding gradually shifting from simple curiosity into genuine, disbelieving shock as I realized exactly what I was looking at. A formal deed bearing my mother's own name, dated a full 12 years earlier, for a property address I had never once heard mentioned throughout my entire adult life. I want to describe my reaction to discovering this specific document because it represents a genuine, disorienting recalibration of everything I had believed about my mother's estate for the previous 2 years. I sat at my own kitchen table, staring at this property deed, feeling a specific, complicated shock, understanding that my mother had apparently maintained private ownership of a significant, previously unknown asset for over a decade, information she had never once shared with any of us throughout her own lifetime. I want to tell you about the additional documents I found within this same folder, because understanding their full content matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded. Alongside the property deed, I found a formal, notarized letter my mother had written, explaining her specific reasoning for maintaining this property privately, along with detailed instructions regarding how she wanted it eventually handled following her death. I want to share what my mother's letter actually said, because I have read it countless times in the months since this discovery, and its specific content carries, I think, considerable significance for understanding her actual, deliberate intentions. I remember reading this letter for the first time sitting alone at my own kitchen table. My mother's distinctive handwriting, immediately recognizable, even in this digital scanned format. The same careful, deliberate script I remembered from countless birthday cards and grocery lists throughout my entire life. I remember my hands trembling slightly as I read, understanding that I was hearing my mother's own voice, in a very real sense, explaining something she had apparently never felt able to share with me directly during her own lifetime. She wrote, "Sabine, if you're reading this, it means you've finally found your way to this account, exactly as I hoped you eventually would. I purchased this property 12 years ago, using savings I set aside quietly over many years, understanding, even then, that I wanted something separate, something entirely my own, that I could eventually decide how to use without any family discussion or debate influencing that decision. I have rented it out quietly through a property management company all these years, using the modest income to supplement my own retirement, and I never told any of you about it, understanding that once family knows about an asset, it inevitably becomes a subject of discussion, expectation, and sometimes even conflict. Exactly the kind of complication I wanted to spare all three of you during whatever years I had left. I want this property to go to you specifically, not because I love you more than your brother or sister, but because I watched you, more than either of them, quietly set aside your own needs to help me throughout these difficult final years. And I wanted you to have something entirely your own, free from any family obligation to share or discuss it, exactly the same freedom I built for myself with this property over the past 12 years. I remember sitting with this letter for a long while after finishing it, understanding, slowly, exactly what my mother had actually built and protected over more than a decade of quiet, private effort. A specific kind of independence I had never once suspected she was carefully cultivating alongside her more visible, ordinary life. I want to tell you about the specific legal documentation included alongside this letter, because understanding its actual formal significance matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. The folder also contained a formal, notarized codicil to my mother's will, specifically confirming that this particular property, separate entirely from her primary estate, was intended solely for me. A legal document she had apparently prepared with an attorney different from the one who had handled her primary estate planning. I remember examining this codicil closely, noting the specific date at the top, roughly 8 years before her death, considerably before her cancer diagnosis, evidence I understood that she had begun formally protecting this specific arrangement years before any serious illness ever entered the picture, a decision made from genuine, deliberate foresight rather than any last-minute urgency related to her declining health. I remember the notary's own signature and seal, along with a witness signature I didn't recognize, evidence of exactly how seriously my mother had approached ensuring this document would carry genuine, unquestionable legal weight whenever it eventually surfaced. I later contacted the attorney's office listed on this codicil, curious whether anyone there might remember the specific circumstances of my mother's original visit, and I spoke briefly with a paralegal who explained that the attorney who had originally drafted the document had since retired, though she was able to confirm, through their office's own retained records, that my mother had visited on 3 separate occasions over several months to finalize this particular arrangement, taking, evidently, considerable care to ensure every detail was handled precisely as she wanted it. I want to describe my reaction to discovering the specific legal document because understanding my genuine, complicated emotional response matters for everything that eventually happened. I sat with these documents for a considerable time before I could fully process what they actually meant, understanding that my mother had spent 12 years quietly, privately building and maintaining an asset she had deliberately kept entirely separate from her family's broader knowledge, understanding, with what I recognized as genuine, careful insight into our family's specific dynamics, exactly why she believed this particular approach would serve all of us better than more open, immediate disclosure. I want to tell you about the specific investigation I conducted to verify this property's actual current status, because understanding my careful, deliberate process matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. I contacted the property management company my mother's letter had identified, explaining the situation and requesting verification regarding the property's current condition and rental status. I remember searching for this company's contact information, a small local business I found, still operating in the same distant town where my mother's property was apparently located, and I remember drafting my initial email carefully, uncertain exactly how to explain my genuinely unusual situation, a daughter discovering, entirely by accident, that her deceased mother had apparently owned property none of the family had ever known about. I remember the specific anxiety of waiting for their response, checking my own email repeatedly over the following 2 days, genuinely uncertain whether this entire discovery might somehow prove to be some kind of misunderstanding or error. I remember, finally, receiving their response, a warm, detailed email confirming everything I had discovered, along with an invitation to visit their office in person if I wanted to review the complete rental history and maintenance records they had carefully maintained throughout the entire 12 years of managing this property on my mother's behalf. I took them up on this invitation the following week, sitting across from the same friendly representative I'd originally spoken with by phone, paging through folder after folder of carefully organized records, each one representing a small, tangible piece of the quiet, independent life my mother had built entirely on her own. I want to tell you what this property management company confirmed, because their information revealed something considerably more significant than even my mother's letter alone had suggested. The company confirmed that the property had, in fact, been continuously rented throughout the preceding 12 years, generating modest but consistent rental income my mother had received throughout this entire period, income that had apparently supplemented her own retirement without any of us ever noticing or questioning where these additional funds originated. I remember calling this property management company with a specific, nervous uncertainty, half expecting to learn that some mistake had occurred, that my mother's name had simply been misattached to a property she never actually owned. I remember the representative I spoke with, a genuinely friendly woman who had apparently worked with my mother directly on several occasions over the years, confirming, without any hesitation, that yes, Odette had owned this property for over a decade, describing her as a wonderful, easy landlord who always handled maintenance requests promptly and treated her tenants with genuine consideration. I remember hearing this stranger describe my own mother in this specific, unfamiliar context, a strange, disorienting sense of learning about an entirely separate dimension of her life I had simply never known existed. I want to describe my reaction to learning this specific detail, because it represents the actual moment I understood the full, sustained scope of my mother's careful, private financial management. I felt, learning this information, a specific mixture of admiration and genuine astonishment, understanding that my mother had managed this entire property, its tenants, its maintenance, its financial arrangements, quietly and independently for over a decade, without any of us ever suspecting she was managing anything beyond her own, considerably more modest, visible financial life. I want to tell you about the property's current formal appraised value, because understanding this specific figure matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. A formal appraisal, which I commissioned shortly after this discovery, valued the property at approximately $340,000, a figure considerably exceeding the total combined value of everything else in my mother's primary estate that had already been divided equally among the three of us. I remember receiving this specific appraisal figure via email, sitting alone in my own home office, reading it several times before the actual number fully registered against everything I already knew about our family's more modest primary estate. I remember calculating, almost automatically, exactly how this figure compared to what each of us had already received from our mother's original estate division, understanding, with a specific, growing discomfort, exactly how significant this particular discrepancy actually was. I want to describe my reaction to learning this specific figure, because understanding my genuine, complicated emotional response matters for everything that eventually happened. I did not feel simple, uncomplicated excitement upon learning this specific figure. I felt, instead, something considerably more layered, genuine gratitude for my mother's careful, deliberate foresight, alongside a specific, growing concern regarding exactly how my siblings might eventually react to learning that our mother had left me a significant asset entirely separate from our previously equal estate division. I want to tell you about the specific decision I made regarding how to approach this discovery with my siblings, because understanding my careful, deliberate process matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. I decided, before informing Marcus and Elise of this discovery, to consult with an estate attorney, understanding that I wanted to fully comprehend my own legal standing and options before initiating what I anticipated would be a genuinely difficult family conversation. I remember my first meeting with this attorney, a careful, patient woman named Ms. Delacroix, bringing with me the complete folder of documents I'd discovered: my mother's letter, the property deed, the notarized codicil, watching her review each piece methodically with the same professional thoroughness I imagine she brought to every client's situation. I remember asking her, somewhat anxiously, whether my siblings might have any legitimate legal claim to a portion of this property, understanding that I genuinely wanted to know the honest, complete legal picture before I said anything to either of them. I want to tell you what this attorney explained, because her guidance clarified something critically important about exactly how legally secure my own claim to this property actually was. She explained that the notarized codicil my mother had prepared, confirming her specific intention that this property belongs solely to me, represented a legally valid, enforceable document, meaning that my siblings held no legitimate legal claim to any portion of this specific asset, regardless of how our mother's primary estate had otherwise been divided equally between the three of us. I want to tell you about the specific conversation I eventually had with Marcus and Elise, because it represents, I think, the actual climax of this entire story. I requested a meeting with both of them, explaining only that I had recently discovered some significant additional information regarding our mother's estate that I needed to discuss with both of them directly, deliberately not revealing, in advance, the full extent of what I had already learned. I want to describe that meeting carefully, because the specific way it unfolded matters considerably for understanding the genuine complexity of what I eventually learned about my siblings' actual reactions. We met at my own home, and I laid out the complete documentation I had discovered: our mother's handwritten letter, the formal property deed, the notarized codicil, and the appraisal confirming the property's current substantial value. I remember that specific meeting taking place around my own kitchen table, Marcus and Elise arriving together, both visibly curious given how deliberately vague I had remained about the actual reason for this requested conversation. I remember the specific quiet that settled over the room as they each read through our mother's letter, Elise's hand rising slowly to her mouth partway through, Marcus setting the property deed down and picking it back up again, as though rereading the specific address might somehow make it feel more genuinely real. I did not raise my voice through any part of this conversation. I had learned, through everything this particular discovery had taught me, that the truth, properly documented and calmly presented, rarely needs volume to be genuinely effective. I want to describe Marcus and Elise's reactions to this presentation, because understanding their specific, genuine responses matters for the full resolution of this entire story. Both of them, reading through our mother's letter together, grew visibly emotional, Elise specifically tearing up as she read our mother's explanation regarding why she had chosen this particular arrangement, understanding, I think, exactly the same, genuine, careful reasoning our mother had articulated regarding her own desire to protect all three of us from potential family conflict during her final years. I remember Marcus quietly reading a specific passage aloud, our mother's line about wanting to spare all three of us, exactly the kind of complication she'd witnessed in other families. And I remember him nodding slowly afterward, understanding, I think, some specific family history or observation our mother had likely witnessed over the years that had shaped this particular, careful decision. I want to tell you about the specific conversation that followed regarding this discovery's implications, because understanding this discussion matters for the complete resolution of this entire story. Marcus asked, directly but without any apparent resentment, whether I intended to honor our mother's specific, documented wishes exactly as she had outlined them, a question I understood as reflecting genuine curiosity rather than any challenge to my legitimate legal claim. I remember his tone throughout this question, careful and genuinely thoughtful rather than defensive, and I remember appreciating, in that specific moment, the particular kind of steady, even-tempered presence Marcus had always brought to our family's more difficult conversations throughout our entire lives. I remember him adding, almost immediately after asking this question, that whatever I decided, he trusted it would be fair, a statement of genuine confidence in me that I found unexpectedly quite moving given the specific weight of what we were actually discussing. I want to describe my own response to this specific question because I think understanding my genuine, thoughtful decision-making process matters for the complete resolution of this entire story. I told Marcus and Elise, directly, that I intended to honor our mother's documented wishes regarding the property's ownership, but that I wanted to find some way to acknowledge this significant, unexpected discovery in a manner that felt genuinely fair to our entire family, understanding that our mother's specific reasoning, however sound, didn't necessarily need to be the absolute final word regarding how we chose to navigate this situation together going forward. I want to tell you about the specific proposal I ultimately offered, because understanding this resolution matters for the complete story of everything that happened. I propose setting aside a modest but genuine portion of the property's ongoing rental income, distributed annually between all three of us, understanding this as a voluntary gesture reflecting our family's genuine bond rather than any legal obligation, given that our mother's documentation clearly, legally established my sole ownership. I remember presenting this specific proposal carefully, explaining my reasoning to Marcus and Elise directly, that while I fully intended to honor our mother's clear, documented wish that the property itself belonged to me alone, I also genuinely wanted some way of ensuring this unexpected discovery didn't create any lingering sense of unfairness or resentment within our family, understanding that our mother's own careful planning had always been motivated by a desire to protect our relationships, not to create new distance between us. I want to tell you about Marcus and Elise's reaction to this proposal, because understanding their eventual response matters for the full resolution of this entire story. Both of them genuinely appreciated this gesture, though Elise specifically told me that she didn't feel entitled to any portion of what our mother had so clearly, deliberately intended for me alone, understanding, with what struck me as genuine, generous clarity, that our mother's specific reasoning deserved to be honored fully, rather than diluted by any family redistribution, however well-intentioned. I remember Elise's specific words during this conversation, telling me that our mother had clearly thought carefully about this decision for over a decade, and that overriding even a portion of that considered intention, however generously I meant the gesture, would feel like a betrayal of exactly the kind of careful, deliberate planning our mother had worked so hard to protect. I remember Marcus nodding along with this sentiment, though he did eventually agree to accept a small token portion of the rental income I insisted on offering, understanding it, he said, less as any genuine entitlement and more as a way of allowing all three of us to feel some small, ongoing connection to this unexpected piece of our mother's private legacy. I want to be honest with you about how I feel now, several weeks removed from that conversation with my siblings. I do not feel simple, uncomplicated triumph, the way you might expect from a story that resolves this dramatically through a hidden password and a substantial financial discovery. I feel instead something considerably more complicated, genuine grief for my mother that arrived freshly, unexpectedly, alongside profound gratitude for her careful, deliberate foresight, and a renewed, deeper understanding of exactly how thoughtfully she had navigated our family's specific dynamics throughout her final years. I have visited the property itself twice now since this discovery, driving the 2 hours to see, in person, the small house my mother had privately maintained for over a decade. I remember the specific, strange emotion of standing outside it for the first time, understanding that I was looking at something my mother had walked through countless times herself, coordinating repairs and tenant arrangements entirely independently, building this quiet, separate piece of her own life without a single one of us ever suspecting its existence. I have decided, tentatively, to continue renting it out through the same property management company my mother trusted for so many years, understanding it as its own small, meaningful way of honoring the specific, careful independence she clearly valued so deeply in maintaining it herself. I remember standing in the small, tidy front yard during my first visit, imagining my mother walking that same path decades earlier, meeting with contractors or greeting new tenants, an entirely separate, private version of her I had genuinely never known existed. I remember speaking briefly with the current tenant, a young couple who mentioned, warmly, that they'd heard wonderful things about the previous, long-time owner from the property manager. Understanding, in that specific moment, that my mother's quiet, careful stewardship of this property had built its own small, genuine legacy entirely separate from anything our immediate family had ever witnessed firsthand. My relationship with Marcus and Elise has, if anything, grown considerably warmer since this entire discovery, both of them expressing genuine admiration for how I chose to handle what could easily have become a genuinely difficult family conflict. We speak now, more often than before, about our mother specifically, sharing memories and small details we're each individually recalling as we continue processing this unexpected, additional layer to her life that none of us had previously known to look for. I remember one particular conversation with Elise, several weeks after our initial meeting, where she told me she'd started going through her own old photographs and letters from our mother, wondering aloud whether there might be other small, quiet secrets tucked away somewhere she simply hadn't thought to look for yet. I remember us laughing together, a genuinely lighter, easier laugh than the heavier emotions that had characterized our earlier conversations about this discovery, both of us agreeing that our mother had apparently been considerably more interesting and complex than either of us had ever fully appreciated during her own lifetime. A realization that felt, ultimately, less unsettling than genuinely endearing, evidence of a woman who had quietly built and protected an entire, meaningful dimension of independence for herself, right alongside the loving, present mother we had always known. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. Digital accounts and cloud storage deserve genuine, careful attention during estate settlement, regardless of how easily they might be dismissed as containing nothing more significant than casual photographs or routine correspondence. My family nearly overlooked, entirely, an asset worth considerably more than the rest of our mother's estate combined, simply because we assumed her digital life held nothing of genuine significance. Here is a second truth I have carried with me since this discovery. The people who love us most quietly, without demanding recognition, sometimes carry a clearer understanding of family dynamics than we ourselves fully recognize while we're still living inside them. My mother observed something about our family's potential for conflict over shared inheritance that she never fully articulated to any of us directly, and her careful, deliberate planning reflected a considerably more clear-eyed understanding of our family's actual dynamics than any of us would have credited her with at the time. Here is a third truth. Documentation, prepared carefully and communicated through a single, deliberately simple password, can preserve genuine intentions that might otherwise be lost entirely to casual, incomplete assumptions about what someone's digital life actually contains. My mother's specific foresight in preparing and carefully entrusting this password ensured her actual wishes eventually reached exactly the person she intended, however many years that discovery ultimately required. Here is a fourth truth. Quiet vindication does not require withholding generosity from others simply because the law technically permits us to do so. I chose to share a modest portion of this unexpected discovery with my siblings, not because I was legally required to, but because preserving our family's genuine relationships mattered considerably more to me than maximizing whatever financial advantage this discovery technically afforded me. Here is a fifth truth, one I didn't fully understand until visiting that property in person for the first time. Sometimes the people we love build entire separate dimensions of independence for themselves that have nothing to do with distrust or secrecy toward the people around them, but everything to do with their own genuine, private need to feel some measure of complete autonomy over at least one meaningful piece of their own life. And here is the last truth I want to leave you with. Sometimes the people we love spend years quietly building something entirely their own, understanding, with remarkable foresight, exactly how and when that private effort should eventually be revealed, trusting that whoever eventually discovers it will handle that revelation with the same careful, thoughtful consideration they themselves brought to building it in the first place. That is my story. 2 years of believing our family's digital estate held nothing of significance. One forgotten envelope rediscovered while organizing a kitchen cookbook, and one carefully hidden password that finally revealed exactly what my mother had quietly, deliberately built for me across 12 years I never even knew to imagine. I think sometimes about that specific afternoon she handed me the envelope, pausing our movie to retrieve it from her side table drawer, delivering it with a seriousness I didn't fully appreciate at the time. I don't think, even now, I fully understand every reason she chose that particular moment, or why she trusted me specifically with this responsibility rather than either of my siblings. I think it's possible she simply recognized, in whatever quiet way mothers sometimes do, that I would eventually find my way to it exactly when I needed to, patient enough to wait the 2 years it apparently took, and careful enough, once I finally discovered it, to handle what it revealed with the same thoughtfulness she'd clearly hoped for. I still keep that small original envelope, now empty of its password but genuinely meaningful nonetheless, tucked back inside her same well-worn cookbook, understanding it now as something considerably more significant than simple kitchen clutter, a small physical reminder of exactly how much careful, private love a person can build quietly across years, waiting patiently to be discovered. I have thought, more than once since this discovery, about how many other families likely have their own version of this same story, waiting quietly in an unexplored cloud account or an unopened digital file, some genuine significance sitting patiently, entirely unnoticed, simply because grief and practical urgency made it easier, in the immediate aftermath of a loss, to focus on what felt more tangible and immediately pressing. I think about my mother often now, understanding her, finally, as someone considerably more complete than the singular, familiar role of mother I had always, comfortably, reduced her to throughout my own life, a woman who built her own quiet independence carefully, deliberately, and who trusted, ultimately, that I would eventually find my way to understanding exactly why she chose to build it the way she did. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that the digital lives our loved ones leave behind sometimes carry considerably more significance than anyone initially realizes, I would love to hear from you. Tell me, in your own words, about a time something you nearly dismissed turned out to carry far more meaning or value than you originally understood. If this helped you tonight, a simple like lets me know these stories are genuinely worth continuing to tell. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next story.